Okay. Good evening. Good evening, everybody. My name is John Schreiber. I'm greeting you from NJPAC in Newark, and I welcome you to tonight's conversation with Cooperman. We are really grateful to the Art Center's friend and benefactor, Lee Cooperman, for holding these deep dive talks with national figures in business, politics, economics with us. We've been doing them virtually for a while. Lee, as you know, is an extraordinary financial thought leader whose work at Goldman Sachs and at the firm he founded, Omega Advisors, made him one of the most influential figures in American investing. He's also a philanthropist of almost unequal commitment. Along with his wife, Toby, they're signers of the Giving Pledge, affirming their intention to devote the majority of their wealth to charitable causes in their lifetimes. Their generosity has built libraries and other facilities at universities, in particular at his alma mater of Hunter College and at Columbia Business School. And he's funded numerous student scholarships, including the Cooperman College Scholars Program, which allows deserving young men and women from here in Essex County to complete their education. And they've also supported numerous healthcare organizations. You may have read recently their gift of $100 million to RWJ Barnabas, and now the St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston has been renamed the Cooperman Barnabas Medical Center. To NJPAC, Lee and Toby and their family have been steadfast and inspiring supporters. They've contributed to us for decades and endowed our annual Kwanzaa Family Festival, and most recently, they made a foundational gift that will allow us to build the Cooperman Family Arts Education and Community Center, a new home for our performing arts training programs and free community engagement events. And it will also offer rehearsal spaces for professional artists to create new work here in Newark, as well as an institute for the development of new arts training curricula and a lot more. It is my pleasure right now to thank Lee for bringing Dr. Larry Summers, the 71st Secretary of the Treasury, to speak with him and us tonight about the country's economic outlook. Just to remind everybody of tonight's schedule, Lee will interview Dr. Summers, and then we'll open the discussion to your questions. If you'd like to ask Lee or Dr. Summers a question, you can do so at any time by typing it into the Q&A box, and you'll find that Q&A box when you hover your cursor at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Lee, the floor is yours.
John, thank you for your very gracious comments. I'm frankly very excited about this evening for a couple of reasons. First, I think we're going to learn a great deal from a brilliant person. Also, I would first like to thank Larry for virtually crossing the Hudson River to share his substantial wisdom with us. His CV is most impressive, and I'm going to share a small part of it with you. Larry, who, Lawrence goes by Larry, he served as the 71st Secretary of the Treasury. He was Director of the National Economic Council, President of Harvard University, and the Chief Economist of the World Bank. Has a uniquely informed perspective on how to manage an economic recovery. And he's worked for both the Clinton and Obama administrations at the World Bank. And he played a pivotal role in addressing every major financial crisis of the last 3 decades. And is the only Treasury Secretary in the past half century to have left office with the national budget in surplus. My guess is that's a record that's going to stand as long as Babe Ruth's record, maybe longer. He's going to talk about really the questions we ask him, both me and the audience. I really am a little confused now, and I have to admit, I made my money historically as a bull. I did not make much money on the short side. I am a disciple of Warren Buffett, who said nobody ever got rich being short America. But I've become somewhat pessimistic about the long-term outlook. And the things that shape my thinking, which Larry could put more hair on, is I think if we had 100 economists in a room and asked them, what is the potential real growth of the US economy? I think the answer would be centered around 2% real as trend. And that's maybe 1.5% productivity, half of 1%. Labor force growth, if you're a bull, maybe say 2.5%. If you're a bear, maybe 1.5%, but around 2%. Okay, and then another 2% for inflation, 4% nominal. We're growing at 3 or 4 times potential, yet the central bank has been persisting in holding interest rates at 0. That doesn't make any sense to me, and I'll explain why in a second and have Larry focus on that. Secondly, I think we've already injected into the economy $1 trillion of stimulus in excess of wages lost, and they're trying to go for another $3.5 trillion, which I think, thanks to Manchin and the lady from Arizona, probably won't happen. So it's very clear that the central bank and the administration has elevated unemployment relative to everything else as their priority. So economic activity in the United States measured by either real or nominal GDP hit a record high in the second quarter. The losses in business activity related to the pandemic have been erased, and GDP is hitting new highs, new record highs. There are now shortages of everything from labor to semiconductors, as the reopening has been faster than expected. So my first question is, how do you see economic growth and inflation unfolding over the next 12 months, Larry?
Lee, let me say that it's a privilege to be here with the New Jersey Performing Arts Center, and it's a particular privilege to do this conversation with you. You are a living legend of practical investing economics for everything that you have done over so many years. And every time I talk to you, I learn something practical.
Tell that to Elizabeth Warren, your senator.
Practical about markets, and I may not always share every political conviction that you have, though I share many. I always do learn things.
Thank you. Thank you.
Broadly on the United States, I think that the great strength of the United States is our capacity for self-denying prophecy. That we screw things up. Winston Churchill had a point when he said the United States does the right thing, but only after exhausting the alternatives. But ultimately, we have a capacity to become alarmed and to fix things. And you can see it in the way we responded after Jimmy Carter's malaise speech. You can see it in the fears we had about the Soviet Union surpassing us in 1960. You can see it in the fears that everything was over at the time of the Depression or the Civil War, or even Patrick Henry talking about the spirit of the revolution had been lost. So yes, I think there's a tremendous amount to worry about right now, but I also think that it's a mistake not to recognize the United States' capacity to respond to alarms. You raised what I think is a major thing to be alarmed about in financial markets today, inflation. There are a lot of ways of looking at the inflation process. One is to look at demand and supply for stuff. And we've got a record level of vacancies relative to unemployment right now. And that tells us that the labor market is going to be a source of inflation. We've got major shortages showing up as a 20% increase in house prices and rents over the last year. It hasn't yet really begun to appear in a significant way in the CPI, and that's coming. We have bottlenecks of everything from semiconductors to Christmas decorations, and that's headed for potential problems. So if you look at demand and supply, you see a lot of signs of inflation. Another way to look at things is to look at the abundance of liquidity. And as you said, look at what's happening with the issuance of government debt. If you look at what's happening in terms of the Fed's level of interest rates, the rate at which the Fed is purchasing government bonds, if you look at the size of the savings overhang from the money people weren't able to spend during COVID, all of that is pointing towards a wall of money coming at a finite supply of goods. And that suggests the likelihood of inflation. So I think we're looking at a pretty substantial probability of inflation rising pretty significantly. Policymakers believe that this is all going to be transitory, and they believe that expectations of future inflation are going to be anchored. No one ever knows, but I don't understand why they have those beliefs. I look at the two most important and large markets in the economy, with the labor market and the housing market, and I see more inflation to come in the future than in the past, not less. I look at what's happening just in the surveys we're starting to see, and it's hard to see why we wouldn't have more inflation psychology starting to develop. This is a situation that reminds me very much of the late 1960s. A super ambitious government running a big budget deficit, a strong wishing for a super tight labor market that will help people who are disadvantaged, a tendency to see inflation, but to blame it on transient structural factors, a sense that somehow there's some kind of stable Phillips curve, so everything will be anchored. That was what was going on in the 1960s. And inflation went from having a one handle in 1966 to having a six handle by the end of 1969. And that was before we started having the supply shocks of the 1970s. We've had two Fed chairmen in history who tended to blame inflation on specific structural factors in specific markets. One was G. William Miller in the late 1970s, and the other was Arthur Burns in the early 1970s. And they are not well remembered for the control that they kept on the inflation process. And so I am fearful that we are making those kinds of mistakes again. There's still time to start to act. I don't for a moment think we're going to get back to the kind of double-digit inflation rates we had in the late 1970s. But it seems to me that the risks are overwhelmingly on the side of rising inflation. And it seems to me that when rising inflation comes, it is going to be difficult to counteract. Difficult to counteract given the social pressures to maintain economic strength, given the financial markets sensitivity to what happens to interest rates, given the risks that the economy will be slowed by all of these bottlenecks. So I think it's a difficult macroeconomic environment that we are headed into in coming months. I leave it to professionals like you, Lee, to predict what that's going to mean for the stock market in general and what that's going to mean for particular stocks. But I do think that it is quite extraordinary that interest rates are as low as they are, given the economic environment. And I think the likelihood is very much that they will rise significantly over the next year.
Right. We'll get to interest rates in a moment. I would just observe, I'm very surprised how little talk is given to the importance of wage rates. 64% of a typical business cost is wages, and they're not going down in this environment, and they're not going to go down unless we go into a recession. I mean, there's 11 million job openings and there's 10 million unemployed. So it would seem to me it's a prescription for wages to stay very high. And secondly, your first your introductory comments, where you struck an optimistic tone. As I listened to you, it came to me an old expression I use: we have leadership out of crisis. We get leadership, but we're in a crisis. But we're living too comfortably with the existing policies. We don't have a crisis, and financial markets don't reflect the crisis. So it sounds to me like if we're going to get intelligent leadership, we probably have to fall into some kind of crisis, which the S&P or the market doesn't reflect at the current time. And so I understand your view, and I buy into it. In terms of interest rates, Fed policy seems foolish and also adding to income disparity. And they're also forcing everybody out in the risk curve. The one, I could be less politic than you because I don't have your lofty perch. But, I'm critical of Powell when he says the market's not overvalued because of where interest rates are. But he doesn't want to say that interest rates have no business belonging where they are. So I say what he's done, he's forced everybody out in the risk curve. The historical risk-averse player who bought T-bills says, I can't survive on zero, so I'll take duration risk and I'll buy T-bonds. The T-bond guy says, or gal or person says, I can't get by on 1.5%, I'll buy industrial bonds. The industrial bond player says, 3% doesn't do anything for me, I'll buy high yield. The high yield player says 5 or 6 is inadequate, I'm going to buy collateralized loan obligations. The CLO player says, the hot market's equities, I'm going to put 25% of my fixed income fund in equities. And the equity guy said, I'm putting 2% in Bitcoin. And that's what's going on. And I assume somewhere out there, we got to come back in off the risk curve. I don't know. I don't want to insult anybody, but I don't know who the hell would buy a bond other than an idiot. If you pay taxes at 37% and you keep 63% of 1.5 and you have an inflation rate of 5 or 6%, basically, you're getting a capital confiscated. I'd rather take a shot on a stock. So interest rates, and then you got to look at interest rates where they belong. Historically, the 10-year government bond is yielded in line with nominal GDP. So trend nominal, let's say, is 4%. This year, we're running, 7 or 8%. And we have interest rates near zero. Now, it's a global game, so everybody says, well, if they let interest rates go up a lot, that's going to be, too powerful for the dollar, et cetera. I think there's a bunch of academicians running monetary policy around the world. Interest rates in Japan are zero, interest rates in Germany are zero, our interest rates are relatively high versus the rest of the world. And I don't know, I'm sympathetic, I'm detached from the reality. So I don't know if, I assume that if a working man accumulated $1 million or $2 million over his lifetime, that's a lot of money. He goes to his financial planner, he says, I want to retire. What can I earn on my money? The guy tells him nothing. So he can't afford to retire, which reduces the opportunity for young people to enter the labor force. So I don't know. Where are interest rates going to be in a year or two, in your opinion?
So you said a lot of things, many of which I agreed with. I would plead on behalf of my fellow academics that whatever they are, neither Mr. Bailey in England, nor Ms. Lagarde in Europe, nor Mr. Kuroda in Japan, nor Mr. Powell in the United States are academics. So we academic economists have plenty to answer for, but I don't think we have to answer for the current current monetary policy. So as somebody who spent his life in academia, I'm not quite sure it's fair to blame academics for the level of monetary policy. Second thing I'd say, I'll come to interest rates in a second, Lee, but the second thing I'd say is I think the question of the distributional consequences of monetary policy is a complicated one and is a little bit more ambiguous than you said. You said two things that are right. You said low interest rates mean high asset prices, and that's good for wealthy people. And you said low interest rates mean low return on your retirement savings, and that's bad for middle-class people saving in their retirement. Those are true points. It's also true that low interest rates mean low borrowing costs for families starting to buy houses. It's also true that low interest rates to some extent translate into lower priced car loans, translate into lower priced home equity loans. So the impact of interest rates is kind of complicated on distribution. There are respects in which the broad pattern is that rich people lend to poor people, and lower interest rates in that sense may benefit people with lower incomes. So I think the question of the distributional implications of low interest rates is more complicated. I agree with you about the impact of low interest rates on encouraging risk taking, and that there's more risk of various kinds of financial bubbles in the context of low interest rates. that riff of yours about the treasury guy, the bill guy buying bonds and the equity guy buying Bitcoins, I'm going to, first time I repeat it, I'm going to attribute it to you. And ever after, when I repeat it, I'm just going to take credit for it myself. I think that captures something real and seriously concerning in the situation. Look, I think the preponderant probability is that rates will rise because there will be a kind of inevitability to the Fed taking some cap off. There'll be a higher level of inflation. There'll be fewer people who want to buy bonds for the reasons that you said. And so I think you'll see longer term pressure, longer term upwards pressure on interest rates. So I am inclined to agree with you. There is one factor in the last few months that goes in exactly the opposite direction of what you said, which is worth commenting on. There are a significant number of defined benefit pension plans that used to be underfunded, and now, thanks to the raging bull market, are fully funded and have decided to lock in their fully funded character by immunizing their liabilities. And so in response to their success, have shifted from equities to longer term treasury bonds. And I think that's been a factor that has held down longer term treasury bond yields. Now, I don't think that's a factor that's going to last forever. I don't think that's a flow that's always going to be with us. But I think that is a factor that goes in the opposite direction and it is relevant in understanding why long-term bond yields are lower than you and I would expect them to be given the fundamentals.
I think also what's at play, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think Mr. Bernanke figured out in 2008 the economy was going down the toilet and he had to turn the economy, and he figured out the best way to turn the economy is to get wealth up, and the stock market went up. And then we spent the next 10 years where they try to get the capital back from those, 80% of the stocks are owned by 20% of the people, and they're trying to get the money back by having a negative interest rate environment. So there's no return for savings. And now they're trying to double dip again by talking about wealth taxes and other kinds of forms of taxation. But if you look at the level of national debt, debt's growing more rapidly than the economy is growing, which I think will serve as an anchor to economic growth in the future.
I think we are overdoing it right now on the demand side in a serious way. And that, to that extent, Lee, I would agree with you. I do think that we've got some more fundamental structural trends that have operated to encourage private savings and to discourage new investment. And that has operated to reduce the normal level of interest rates. And so some of low interest rates is the fault of monetary policy. Some of low interest rates is driven by, in my view, some more fundamental structural realities. So I think we're largely in agreement, but not completely. But I think I see a role for some structural real factors in explaining lower interest rates.
I've been a voice in the wilderness. Whenever I'm on TV, I say I believe in the progressive income tax structure. I believe rich people should pay more in taxes. What we have to do as a nation is coalesce around the question, what should the maximum tax rate be on wealthy people? I think President Biden is creating a misinformation when he says the wealthy pay 8% of their income in taxes. What they're doing, I believe, is taking unrealized capital gains, adding it to income, and saying, well, you're only paying 8% of your income. Okay, what should the maximum tax rate be on wealthy people? He passed away, so we won't say anything negative, but it was Herman Cain who said 999, but that was bullshit. The only person who's given me a straight answer was Warren Buffett. I called him up 9 years ago. I said, Warren, you're making a lot of noise about rich people paying more. I happen to agree. I've taken the giving pledge with him. I intend to give away not half my money. I intend to give away all my money, half while I'm alive and half to my estate for my kids to give away as my legacy to them. And Warren said, well, if you make $1 million a year, 25% marginal tax rate. And if you make over 5 million, 30%. And I believe Bernie Sanders would say 90% marginal tax rate. Elizabeth Warren would say 70 plus a wealth tax. And Paul Krugman, who I questioned, he gave me a precise answer of 64%. I've said on TV, I'm willing to work 6 months for the government and 6 months for myself, so that's 50%. You have a view on what the appropriate maximum tax rate at the margin should be on wealthy people?
50%, I think in the range of 50%, but I'll tell you, I think it's a little 50% would be my answer, but one, we ought to enforce the law, which we don't do a very good job of doing. Two, there are a variety of devices through which wealthy people avoid taxation. Carried interest ought to be taxed as full income. Like-kind exchanges are, to use the kind of language you've used in this interview, bullshit.
1031, 1030, should get rid of 1031.
We should get rid of 1031. If you bequeath your assets to your kids sell them, they ought to pay capital gains tax on the full capital gain, not just on the capital gain from the moment we inherited them. And there is huge underreporting of taxes. In 2016, there were 100 people who had incomes of more than $10 million who didn't file a tax return, who the IRS didn't have the resources to go after. That's a crime. And it's just wrong. The banking industry, and if there are any bankers on this call, I'm sorry to offend you. The banking industry is mounting a huge campaign against an utterly reasonable policy. The utterly reasonable policy is that when you make a substantial deposit in a bank, there should be information reporting so that we can go after businesses that are earning cash or whatever and have information reporting. The banking industry is at war with that policy, basically in support of tax evasion. They're claiming that it's some kind of enormous burden, even though they report fully on all the interest that those deposits earn right now. So there's no real burden that's being imposed. And the evidence is, get this, by collecting taxes that are owed but not paid, there's a $7 trillion tax gap projected over the next 10 years of taxes that are owed legally under today's tax law but not paid. It defies the imagination that the United States is not capable of collecting 15% of that. And it would be $1 trillion. And it would over the next 10 years, and it would disproportionately come from people with very high incomes, because the kind of taxes we collect best are labor income, because there's a W-2. And so if I'm for 50% federal plus state plus local, however it's going to be designed, plus a property tax on your house, no other wealth tax.
So excuse me for interrupting.
Real enforcement of the law and closing of the loopholes I mentioned.
I agree with closing the loophole. Are you saying 50% plus state on top of that?
No, I'm saying 50% inclusive.
Including, yeah, I agree with that.
Right.
You know, you and I think alike. Now, I've been a registered independent for 25 years. When Mike Bloomberg declared for presidency, I switched to the Democratic Party. I'm going to go back to be independent. But I agree with 50%. And I also like the economist, the conservative black economist, Thomas Sowell, who basically said, in this era of social consciousness, what is your fair share of what someone else has worked for? I love that comment. What is your fair share? But I agree with 50%. Now, you're an outstanding educator, and I'm a little bit upset. You know, I wasn't smart enough to get to Bronx High School of Science or Stuyvesant High School. I went to a regular, ordinary high school. But there seems to be a dumbing down of the curriculum. In California, they wanted to eliminate advanced mathematics because certain minorities didn't do well in advanced mathematics, and so on and so forth. And in New York City, the mayor has been supportive of getting rid of some of these programs that reward exceptionalism. What's your take on this stuff?
Look, I think that we need to be a country that makes a central value of equal opportunity. The thing I'm proudest of having done while I was president of Harvard is eliminating any cost of attending Harvard for anybody with a family income below $60,000. I think we've got to make sure that we're fair to people who don't have, to kids who are applying to schools who don't have the kind of advantages that my kids had, or your kid, or that your kids had. But I can tell you, they're not eliminating advanced mathematics in Chinese high schools.
Right.
They're not eliminating programs for kids with genius in Chinese middle schools, and that we cannot ever sacrifice the veneration of excellence in our education system. We have got to make a core decision as we think about education. And there are two very different philosophies, and I fear we are moving towards the wrong one. One philosophy is that self-esteem comes from achievement. The other philosophy is that achievement comes from self-esteem. And that if we tell everybody they're wonderful and treat everybody the same, then everybody will achieve. I don't think that's right. That's why I worked at Harvard to fight grade inflation. And I got rid of what I thought was a hugely embarrassing situation where when I got there, 90% of the students who graduated with honors. And the least common kind of way of graduating was with no honors. And I thought that was appalling, and we managed to change that while I was there. But I think we've got a huge issue of no longer being willing to sufficiently stand up for excellence as a central value that we want in education. There was a report issued by the University of California as guidance to its faculty, in which they said the phrase meritocracy was offensive, and the phrase the American dream comes from working hard was also offensive. And I think down that route is the road to perdition, and is the road to national decline. So I think we absolutely need to be focused on opportunity for everybody. We need to be stronger than we've been in the past, and not tolerate discrimination. But that cannot mean abandoning the idea of excellence, because some people are more excellent than others. And if we do that, I think it's going to have not terrible consequences this year or next year, but it's going to have terrible consequences for the long run. The most discouraging story I have read in the last month was the story about the proposal to abolish programs for gifted kids in the New York City public schools. My hope is that those policies will not be followed up on, because that is not the route to a sound American future.
I agree 1,000%, 1,000%. And, I agree. So we didn't really answer the question, where is the loan bond going to be in a year? Or 2 years?
North of 250, north of 250, I'm 70% sure. Quite possibly in the 3 range.
Gotcha. Okay. Crypto, any thoughts? I have a cop out on crypto. They ask me about crypto. I say, if you don't understand crypto, it means you're old. I'm old. I'm surprised the government has not yet moved to find ways of outlawing it. And the longer they wait, it becomes more entrenched. It's more difficult to do something with it. I think the last thing we need is another competitor to the US dollar.
Too late to eliminate crypto. I would say of the United States, I would say of the dollar, by the way, that the dollar is fortunate in its alternatives. Europe is a museum, Japan is a nursing home, China is a jail, and Bitcoin's an experiment. So I think people should be very careful about counting out the U.S. dollar. With respect to crypto, Lee, look, I think that if crypto somehow succeeds on its merits, not as a regulatory arbitrage, then let it succeed. But we need to make sure that crypto doesn't become a way of avoiding any money laundering. It doesn't become a way of avoiding know your customer. It doesn't become a way of avoiding consumer protection. It doesn't become a way of evading taxes. And so my approach would be to insist on level playing field regulation for crypto. I think we're behind the curve in getting to that. And then let's see how crypto does. There are people who think because of the power of the blockchain and so forth, that it will be remarkably vibrant, and they may be right. There are people who think that its only value so far has really been as a source of regulatory evasion. They may be right, but that's the test. Neutrality towards crypto, and I think we've got some regulatory work to do, whether it's stable coins or know your customer or tax enforcement to get to that point. But if crypto is as meritorious as its advocates believe it is, then it will be able to flourish in an environment where it is legitimated by appropriate regulation, just as an important part of the strength of our securities markets derives from the strength of what the SEC does.
Mhm. We're very aligned in thinking. So, like one of my lines of question, I think we touched on already, was attack of the wealthy. I think in America, you don't envy the wealthy, you want to become part of the wealthy. So the American dream is to work hard, achieve success, and give back what you have made. I tangled with your former boss, President Obama, 7 or 8 years ago when I wrote him a letter saying, you're depreciating the American dream. You're telling the 99% they're being screwed by the 1%, rather than telling them with hard work, luck, and whatever, you can become part of the 1%. And, what I get very upset by, and I'm willing, like Aristotle says that apathy and indifference are the last virtues of society. So in my old age, I've decided to speak up and become a letter writer. As you know, I wrote a letter to Elizabeth Warren, which you very kindly commented on. If I could say publicly, said if I was a paper I submitted in your class, you give me an A+, and that was a better grade than I got most of the time. But what do you think? You think this is a passing thing, or is this something that's going to be a problem long-term for us?
Lee, I find myself probably somewhere between you and President Obama in the way that you describe. On the one hand, I share your antipathy to the politics of envy. And I think that there's something ugly and divisive. The Bible preaches against the value of envy, and I don't think envy is the right way to organize a society. On the other hand, I do think that when we have taxes, they do need to be based on the ability to pay. The fact is that we haven't succeeded in closing the carried interest loophole, despite a large number.
Because of Democrats. That's because Schumer is in New York and his constituents in New York.
I'm not going to be partisan about it. We haven't, and the reason we haven't is not because poor people have resisted. It's because very rich people have used the influence that comes from their riches to preserve that carried interest loophole. We have zoning in most American cities that denies huge opportunities for reasonable cost living to very large numbers of people. That's because of what the political influence of people with substantial amounts of money have been. So I'm with you and I really don't like the politics of envy, but I think it would be a mistake to not understand that there are legitimate issues of the ways in which people who are very wealthy perpetuate their privilege that need very careful consideration by the society. Look, on balance, what I have always said about this is, would you rather there be more people in the country like Jeff Bezos and Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, or would you rather there be fewer? And I'd rather there be more, because a huge byproduct of everything they do is the creation of a very substantial opportunity. And they're not, for the most part, taking their money from other people. They're gaining their money by providing opportunity for customers and employees, and building great opportunities. So I don't want to be for the politics of envy, but I think it's a mistake also to be satisfied with where we are as a society in equality of opportunity, or to believe that everything that's wrong in terms of equality of opportunity can be solved by the charitable decisions of the wealthy. And I believe that it's important to promote a government that is committed to a better society in many, many ways. And I think that it's important to recognize that often governments trying to do the right thing have been thwarted by wealthy interests. Look, take an example where I suspect you and I would be broadly in agreement, but not completely. There have been, over time, excesses in financial regulation, and there have been insufficiencies in financial regulation. It's kind of a problem that major financiers hired 5 lobbyists for every member of Congress to lobby the merits and demerits of Dodd-Frank. That skewed the decision-making process relative to where it should have been. But I'm with you on opposing the politics of envy. I really am. But it's easier to resist those politics of envy if it's also recognized that there's some very problematic subversion of the political process by money. And I think we can maybe approach things in a better way if we recognize both those problems and not just one of them.
Yeah, I'm more closely aligned to you than you think. I'm actually trying to write a book on the subject. That what motivates me is I read somewhere that 30% of the young people in this country think socialism is preferred to capitalism. I don't think they have a clue about what the world is all about. But given the hour, I know that if I was on the other end, I would be very frustrated. There are a bunch of questions from the audience. Chelsea, can I ask you to monitor and present some of the questions?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for a really fascinating conversation. The first question is, what policy options might be helpful in addressing the labor shortage facing so many industries? Is this perhaps a time for encouraging immigration as was done at earlier times of growth in our history, or is there another alternative?
I think we're over enforcing a variety of immigration laws. I think that, the evidence is really very good evidence that refute some of the fears that many people have. One of the most important economic studies that was done in the last several decades was done by my friend David Card, who won the Nobel Prize in economics earlier this week. And he looked at what economists call a natural experiment. When things went crazy in Cuba and there was the Mariel boat lift, there was a massive influx of Cuban immigrants into Miami. And the question is, what happened to wage rates and opportunities for people in Miami? And what happened in particular for people who were less educated? And it's a great experiment because you have a sudden infusion of immigration. And the answer was there was no systematic adverse effect on working people in Miami. And I think that's an important lesson. I don't know how the politics can be managed exactly, but I think that more immigration, certainly more temporary immigration, would be a good thing at a moment like this. I think we can do much better as a country than we do with the substantial fraction of our population that doesn't go to college. Every time I hear my progressive friends advocate debt relief for people who go to college, I say to myself, the people they should be fighting for are the people who need 9 months training to take a job after they graduate from high school in some kind of vocational school. The people they should be fighting for are the people who are going to community colleges, some of whom may go to a 4-year college, some of whom may learn to be a dental hygienist. And I think that if we could focus on the transition from high school to work, the transition from high school to community college to work in a large number of the sectors where we're experiencing substantial bottlenecks, we could do better. I think that President Biden is onto something, and I think he's right when he talks about family leave policies. And if we had a more appropriate set of family leave policies that enable people to take care of an aging parent or an ill child, there'd be more people who'd be able to work. And when they were able to work, that would help alleviate these labor shortages. So I think all of these things are aspects that go into alleviating labor shortages.
Thank you. Our next question, your conclusions are all understandably couched in economic terms. How do you factor in the frozen federal legislative process and the attitude of politicians in both parties that re-election is their primary task?
Term limits.
Look, I'd say a couple things. First of all, there are worse things in a democracy, politicians who want to do what would be popular with the people. It is kind of part of the idea of democracy, and we need to recognize that. I'd also say, and believe me, like I've spent 10 years of my life in the federal government of the United States, so I've been unbelievably frustrated by the slowness of our Congress in acting, that there was some wisdom in our founding fathers. And there are a lot of really bad ideas that have been stopped, for which there was widespread popular enthusiasm. And so taking time and a lot of effort to pass a law is not the worst thing in the world, frustrating as it seems at any particular instant. Look, I think we're going to see, nobody knows for sure, but we are very likely, in my judgment, to see a very major piece of legislation, probably the largest domestic legislation passed by some measures in well over a generation, in terms of the Biden Recovery Act, Reconciliation and Infrastructure Act. And yes, it's immensely frustrating that it's going to pass in November or December, but there may be a kind of brilliance in the system. The system is going to cause it to be paid for to a greater extent than it otherwise would have. The system is going to reduce its scale from the one that was originally proposed and cause it to be more focused than was originally suggested. That's probably a good thing as well. So I think that it is immensely frustrating, so many aspects of our political system. But, I would rather be playing the hand of the United States right now than playing the hand of any other country in the world for all of our terrible problems. I think that there's much more difficulty in other places. I know how much people envy China and envy the way they're able to get things done. But, it says something about a society and the way a society thinks about its future when the average woman has only 1.1 children, even when there are no restrictions. And I think when one thinks about the fundamental health of that society, that's a very, very important thing to remember, not just because of what it means for the age structure down the road, not just for what it means when most people don't have any cousins, though that's a substantial thing, but in some sense, having children is a fundamental act of optimism about the future. And that's something where we still do it, not as much as one might like to see, but it's really at a very low rate in some of the societies people envy. And I think that's an important thing to remember.
On immigration, I would say that I'm most impressed when I watch CNBC how many of the corporate CEOs are not US born. I think legal immigration is wonderful, wonderful. And we made a big mistake in the last few years when we clamped down on that. But whatever. Go ahead, Chelsea.
Why do you think there aren't more public-private sector partnerships in our country? Should the national government or private industries take the lead?
I think that we probably do need more cooperation. I am broadly supportive of the Biden administration, and I'm somebody who's spent my life in the university, but I have to say I wish there were more people who had significant roles in the private sector who were part of the Biden administration, because I think it would give the administration as a whole a better perspective on economic issues. I think it's often hard. Sometimes the private sector is looking to make money, and the public sector wants to be careful on behalf of taxpayers. And so there's a certain amount of mutual suspicion. We had a broad public-private sector partnership around housing with the so-called government-sponsored enterprises, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And for a variety of reasons, that one didn't end up so well, and had a lot to do with the financial problems that caused the 2008 crisis. But look, I would like to see much closer ties in doing research around climate problems between the public and the private sectors. I'd like to see much closer collaborations between the public sector, institutions of education, and the private sector in areas of worker training. I think there's a real need for people on both sides to try to understand the other side. There are people in government who can often talk about business things in ways which sound like ignorant know-it-alls to people who are in business. I can tell you, having been in government, that there are people who come from the private sector with opinions about how the government should run itself, who haven't really taken the trouble to understand any of the issues as the government faces them. So I think we need to try to develop more mutual understanding and let the partnerships come from that mutual understanding. I run a group at Harvard, part of the Kennedy School at Harvard, called the Center for Business and Government. Some of what we're directed at is policy issues around the economy that implicate business. But one of the things we try to discuss with our advisory group and that we try to do is bring together business leaders and government officials to discuss issues of mutual concern in the hope that we can foster public-private cooperation.
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'll ask one more, and I'm sorry that we haven't gotten to all of them. So the question is, can you explain why the Federal Reserve should be able to conduct QE and other radical policies without reporting to anyone? All of our other key stakeholders in government making major decisions are voted on. While I don't disagree with any of the Fed's decisions, it seems intellectually dishonest.
Well, I'm not sure that the questioner's right. I mean, I would regard the Supreme Court as a pretty important institution of government, and it's not voted on. I would regard the Patent Office as a pretty important institution of government that makes pretty important fundamental technological decisions. It's not voted on. I'd regard the SEC that sets the framework in which Lee is able to do his business as a pretty important institution, and its people are not voted on. The Fed is accountable to the Congress, and the chairman of the Fed is required to testify several times a year to Congress and to submit himself to any kind of questioning, and is required to report on the Fed's progress with respect to a variety of specific objectives before the Congress. I'm not sure you would want the Federal Reserve to be immediately taking instruction from the president in the way that the Secretary of the Treasury does. The temptation to generate easy money before elections, for example, might just be too strong. So my own take would be that we've got a very complex system with different parts of the government insulated in various ways to differing degrees from the political process. And I'm not sure that the Fed is particularly in the wrong place. If you look at, for example, the things that happened in the Nixon administration to monetary policies when there was very extensive connection between the democratically elected officials and the central bank, or you look at the things that happened during the Johnson administration during the Vietnam War period, I'm not sure you would necessarily want to have a more immediately political Federal Reserve. So I guess I would take issue with the premise of the question that there's no democratic accountability, and I wouldn't necessarily share the assumption that there should be more than there is now.
Larry, you've been a terrific sport, very educational. I appreciate the balance of your responses. There's so many other things to talk about, particularly in politics. Well, I'm a registered independent. I've said it on TV, so I'll say it here. I voted for Biden because I voted my values and not my pocketbook. I got to tell you, it's scary to see the former president being so vocal and so engaged, and that 74 million people voted for him. It shows you how divided the country is. And that's a real problem. And I'm fearful that we're going to need a crisis to bring everybody together again, and financial markets don't reflect the crisis. And I personally would not be surprised if the market was no higher than it is today, 5 years from today. I think multiples are too high, given the degree of government involvement in the system. You know, we've been on some form of life support since 2008. In that kind of economy, you would tend to think price earnings ratios should be suppressed. But whatever, good sport, great presentation. And we really, on the behalf of NJ PAC, just thank you for, like I said, virtually crossing the Hudson River, and we'll stay in touch and we'll watch things together.
Very glad to help out and very glad to have this opportunity for dialogue with you, Lee, and I hope our paths will continue to cross. Thank you very
We
much.
will. Thank you very much. And thanks everybody for joining us and listening, and I hope you found it productive. And stay safe and stay healthy, everybody. Bye-bye.